Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, peace and blessings be upon His Messenger. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to join us, and certainly thank our speakers for their expertise. Ever since we had the Muslim ban, the country has been in an uproar, and this was an executive order in which President Trump banned Muslims from 7 Muslim majority countries. And I thought it would be a good ground for us to start by discussing an executive order. What exactly is an executive order? We know that it's some sort of law, but I want everyone out there to be on the same page before we proceed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about executive orders. An executive order is a way in which the president enforces laws. So laws come primarily from Congress, from the House, and from the Senate. But then those laws have to be enforced in some way. And many of these laws are enforced through government agencies and departments. For example, like the Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, and so on and so forth. And the head of these departments is the president, ultimately. There's a Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Agriculture, but all of these secretaries are part of the president's cabinet. And so the president actually controls these agencies, and therefore he is in charge of the implementation of the laws passed by Congress. And this is a perfectly legitimate exercise of presidential powers. This is what's been going on for over years, and it's not uncommon for presidents to use executive orders. There's no limit to the number of executive orders that a president can pass, but just like any other law, they can be challenged in a federal court as unconstitutional. And so President Trump has exercised his legal authority by executive order, which is aimed primarily at managing the agencies and how they implement the laws passed by Congress. So the question then becomes, where do we go from here? The situation that we have now, and to help us tell me where we go from here, we have 2 wonderful speakers, Dr. Dalia Fahmy and Brother Shahed Amanullah. So Dr. Fahmy is an assistant professor of political science at Long Island University in Brooklyn. She received her BA from New York University in politics and Middle Eastern studies. She received a second master's in comparative politics at Rutgers, and she also has her Ph.D. in political science from Rutgers. I feel very inadequate now. I thought I was intelligent, but Dr. Fahmy, you just blew me out of the water there. We also have Brother Shahed Amanullah, a good friend of mine. He's co-founder and the chief technology officer of Affinis Labs. He helps to manage the development and launch of incubated initiatives and builds the technology architecture of portfolio companies. In other words, he's an online social entrepreneur. He also co-founded Launch Posse, which is a DC-based startup. He served as senior advisor for technology at the U.S. State Department, where he worked closely with the White House and other government agencies on social entrepreneurship, social media policy, combating online extremism, and fostering innovation. He's also the founder of Producer of Online Content. In 2001, he created Alt Muslim, which was an online magazine with 2.5 million annual readers. He also created, in 1998, Zabiha.com, which is the world's largest halal restaurant guide with 10 million annual users, and he has 500,000 download apps. He's also a civil engineer from Berkeley University, and he received his MBA in finance from Georgetown. So I'm exhausted just reading the qualifications for our speakers. But Dr. Dalia Fahmy, I'd like to start with you on this. What's the role of Congress in accepting or blocking executive order, if any, and what can they do if they don't like an executive order? Can they reverse it somehow?
So Congress is the body of government where laws are actually made. This is according to Article 1 of the Constitution. Article 2 gives the executive power to issue orders, which are meant to be guidelines for the agencies to use. And so if we take a step back and look at what the order does and what the manner with which it was passed, we can begin to elucidate where there can be inroads to rethink the nature of this order. So the executive orders that were issued about 2.5–3 weeks ago suspended the entire US refugee system. They suspended Syrian refugees in particular. And when we think of the sheer number of Syrian refugees that came into the United States in 2016, it was only 12,000 compared to about 3 million that have gone into Turkey. It banned entry from 7 Muslim-majority nations, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, for 90 days. Temporarily banned the entry of dual citizens from those countries as well. Prioritized refugee claims based on religious persecution, preferring Christian refugees over Muslim refugees. And it lowered the number of refugees acceptable from any country in 2017 down to 50,000 in total. And this was all done under the guise of national security. And so the question that came before the courts, and we've seen that there have been several court cases, but in the last one, just out of Washington State, was that none of this is in keeping with national security. None of these countries, none of these refugees are actually sources of national security threats. The refugee population entering into the United States goes through about at least 2 years of vetting, between 18 months to almost 2 years of vetting. Those 7 Muslim majority nations have produced not a single national security threat. There are other nations that have, but interestingly enough, they're not on the list, and we can wonder why, because of economic relationships and strategic relationships that vary. And so essentially what we saw was that the president was issuing orders in the name of national security, bypassing Congress, but because they technically are not in national security interest, this is where the appeals process lies today.
But was he overstepping his bounds? I mean, an executive order is a legal process. Whether we think it was a good executive order is one thing, but was he overstepping his bounds legally speaking?
Well, I think that's what the court said, that the guise of national security with which this was used to bypass Congress is not a valid guise, because this is not a national security issue. It's not a national security threat. The courts even went as far as to say you can actually give evidence of classified evidence in court that will not be released to the public to show that there is a national security threat, and that also was not done. So it's under that guise of national security that the executive order bypassing Congress is seen as invalid.
I see. So, Brother Shahed, what's your take? Let's try to give the president the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, if there are legitimate national security issues, does this executive order do anything whatsoever to further national security? As Dr. Fahmy pointed out, the courts don't think so, but can you give us another perspective on this?
Sure. So another way to look at executive orders is that they're a projection of intent. So let's not forget that the first day of President Obama's office, he signed an executive order ordering the closure of Guantanamo Bay. The day he left office, that had still not been executed on yet. Now you could say that was because he didn't mean it or all these other things, but from within government, I saw multiple attempts to try to actually carry out the executive order, but he, like President Trump, has run into the exact same kinds of obstacles, that there is a legal structure and a legislative structure around which you can't necessarily overrule, right? And so just like President Obama had roadblocks put in front of him as he communicated his intent through these executive orders, President Trump is finding that the exact same machinery is being used against him. One thing that I want to highlight, look behind the words of all these executive orders. What you're seeing with, because I don't want to be caught in this framework that the previous administration didn't care about security. I mean, I saw a concerted effort to try to make sure that, I mean, there is a, whatever extreme vetting President Trump talks about, we already have extreme vetting, and it is a very detailed process, as Dr. Fahmy mentioned. But what has happened is a flipping. In the previous administration, the intent was bring the refugees in unless something tells us we should keep them out. The intent now has been flipped to keep them out unless there's some reason to bring them in. And I want people to dwell on this a little bit, because that is That is going to be the intent from this point forward behind everything that is done. So whether you're talking about the wall, whether you're talking about any of these things, it's flipping the intent to let's do something bad unless we can do something good versus let's do something good unless something prevents us from doing that good. And once we understand that, then we can then use all these same tools that are now standing up to try to right the course.
So so if there is a threat, if you were to advise the president, and if he did want to ban or restrict entry place, where is the threat coming from? Is there a legitimate threat coming from the Middle East, coming from Europe or Africa or Asia, or, you know, is this simply bad policy altogether, or is it simply misguided and it could have been better implemented had he maybe banned travelers from other countries, or just maybe taken a different approach altogether?
He's very cleverly framed it during this campaign as a Muslim ban, and he's carried that same framework into office. If you bring security professionals into the room, and if you say that Europe, for example, has sent 5,000 foreign fighters to IS, right? So you have a group of people that are radicalized enough to commit violence, that are willing to travel, and many of them, you know, have the ability to do so. So if you're looking for vectors from which extremists can come into America, frankly, that would be the first place I would look, is Europe. Because they're actually in the process of sending fighters to commit, right? And so it begs the next question. If your intent is to keep people from flying here to cause us harm, what structure are you going to put in place with respect to Europe to keep them from coming in from there? Any professional who is very seriously looking at this issue is going to be looking at the reality on the ground, those realities. They're not going to make up some, they're not going to, you know, all the people that I know that deal with this issue, they laugh at the executive order because it's an infantile way to look at security, you know, based on kind of countries of origin that you think, you know, emotionally you think that they are sources of instability rather than logically, right? I mean, any attempt to secure our borders that our enemies can look at and poke a hole in within 2 minutes is a bad policy. So if I was in the shoes of these extremists, I would think, great, let's get Jean-Claude from Paris to hop on a plane and go to America because they've left this big gaping hole to do so. So my accusation back to the government is that you are keeping wide open holes for people who wish us harm to go through. So you're not only not making us safer, you're actually making us less safe because you are creating this blind spot that no one's willing to look at.
I see. So that's on the refugee ban and the immigrant ban. Dr. Fahmy, what other controversial executive orders has the president issued in his few weeks of office? It seems like it's been much longer than that, but he's only been in office just a few weeks. What other executive orders has he issued, and what have been some of the ramifications?
So the executive order that was issued not this past Friday, but the one before it, that aims to basically repeal Dodd-Frank, has not gotten much press. But if we look at the protections that were put in place in Dodd-Frank, they were really meant to protect working class Americans and protect their 401ks and make sure that investors did not make any investments that were not in the best interest of the average American. When you repeal and remove Dodd-Frank, you are leaving susceptible to back to Wall Street, the same as 2008, much of America's working classes' security and their 401ks. And so it's not gotten much press. But if we talk about that the majority of Americans that voted for President Trump were the ones that were economically hurting, the repeal of Dodd-Frank targets those very same people. So on the domestic level, economic security, the way we have been talking about it in the past, is now at stake. And so while we have been focusing on the Muslim ban, and we rightfully should, I think there has to be an investigation of what is the overall approach of this president. He came into office under the promise of draining the swamp. But with this last executive order, we see the exact opposite, that he's protecting Wall Street and leaving vulnerable everyday average Americans. So that's one level. But if we can go back to that security question that you had just talked to Shahed about. According to the FBI, the #1 threat facing the United States is homegrown terrorists. It's homegrown militias. Before President Obama came into office, there were only 78 militias. Today, there are 300 militias in the United States. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, white supremacists have increased just in the past year, in 2016. We have seen white supremacist crime triple since the election. Right, the campus that I live next to, Rutgers University, we have seen white supremacist flyers on campus walls. And so when we think about what is the real threat to America today, it is this culture of exclusionary identity, the rise of fascism that was allowed to foment during the last election cycle. And we're seeing the ramifications of it. There has been more violence in the name of identity since the election than there has been in the past 10 years. And that's a question we're going to have to talk about seriously if we really want to talk about security.
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the president, he actually removed white supremacists from the terror watch list. So the CVE program, controversial program countering violent extremism, is now no longer going to even consider white supremacist groups, and it's going to focus exclusively or almost exclusively just on Muslims, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of terrorism in the United States is not committed by Muslims, but it's committed by white supremacists. And so, I mean, this seems like a very blatant attempt to put Muslims in a corner. And as Shahed mentioned, when you've got real threats coming from elsewhere, and those threats don't fit the typical narrative, the Muslim coming from overseas or the homegrown Muslim, these are white Christian males, right? Let's just be frank here. These are white Christian males that are the single largest group that is committing terrorism in America, and yet that group is no longer being even considered by this White House for the countering violent extremism program.
One thing I want to add,
this White House also has a hard time condemning anti-Semitism. This White House also has a hard time condemning homophobic comments. It has a hard time distancing itself from the KKK. So there is a bigger problem, and I'm hesitant to allow you to continue to couch it as the typical violent person is from the Middle East. No, that as statistically speaking, that's not true. The typical violent person is an uneducated white male. And so we actually have to think about, why is it that this White House has almost inadvertently given a carte blanche to uneducated white males who are white supremacists? And the fact that last weekend, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the White House was unable to condemn anti-Semitism makes us question the direction the narrative is heading.
Absolutely, completely agree. And also I want to add that the president is trying to create an ideological battle with respect to Muslims, and actually take it, I mean, it's one thing to talk about extremism from Muslim countries or whatever, but it's a whole other thing to turn it into an ideological battle where you're now criminalizing thought. You're criminalizing thought in such a way that it's so vague that anyone could fall into that rubric. I think that the removal of white supremacy is a horrible thing. If you talk to anyone in the FBI who works on this issue, every single person I've ever talked to will say that by far the bigger threat is militant militia groups. That they actively target law enforcement. I mean, the FBI takes it personally because these people target them. They target government officials. They target law enforcement. So this is like almost personal for them. And so when the president tells them, don't worry about this, You know, our law enforcement officers in the field, you know, have a long history dealing with these people. They know that the threat is there, and so they now feel that the president doesn't have their back. And so frankly, to even make sure that they are doing their job to protect us, we need to reestablish the reality of where the dangers are, and we have to reinforce that publicly, and push back against this nature that somehow people, you know, this idea that less than 1% of American population is somehow scheming to take over this country in some kind of weird way, which is just stoking paranoia and fear, and then building a whole program around that to identify these people and to silence them when they haven't even done anything. This is something that should alarm every American, not just Muslims, every American.
So, Shahed, do you think that this is something that is deliberate by the president? Is it, you know, do you think that he has racist motives? Is he being manipulated by those around him? Does he maybe not have racist or ideological ambitions, but he's just doing this because he thinks this is the best way to you know, to get votes for the next election? Why is this happening? What incentive does have to take the country down this road?
Look, you're talking about a president who in normal times was only too happy to do business with Muslims, only too happy to include them in all does. He is an emotional president. He is putting his finger in the wind and finding out what emotions out there are so heated that he can ride those and build his legacy upon them. He has also opened the doors for truly evil people. Like I think the president is naive and is not ideological when it comes to this, but I think the people he's bringing in the door, frankly, are evil. They're evil. They have evil intent. They have malicious intent. They are not content with just manipulating public opinion, but actually activating public opinion. They want to weaponize the president's policy against Muslims. And the president, frankly, I don't think truly really cares one way or the other. If the president could make $1 billion off of Muslims, he would stop all of this immediately. I think he's just made this calculated decision that it's not going to help him in his presidency. So we need to work with those pressures, right? We need to try to work around not necessarily with facts only, but also with emotions. He's playing up people's emotions. He's acting emotionally. And he's opening the door to people who are truly bigots, and we need to understand that before we can fight it.
Dr. Fahmy?
So there are a couple of things here. You know, this didn't start on January 20th. We have to go back to the first day in March of last year when Ted Cruz announced his candidacy for the Republican primary. The Republican primary of last year was full of vitriol against Muslims. We saw comments like, can a Muslim be trusted? Can Muslims be in cabinet positions? Can a Muslim be president? Can Muslims be part of the fabric of society because this is a Judeo-Christian nation? The entirety of the Republican primary campaign was built on the backs of an exclusionary identity that was emerging in America at the time, of course, against American values. And so what we saw was not just for the first time, I mean, we have seen Islamophobia in the past, but we really saw as part of the political process. And I think this harkens back to 2010. The 2010 election also had to do with the summer right before the election. We saw the controversy over the Ground Zero Mosque, or the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which was not a mosque and not at Ground Zero, but it didn't matter. The rhetoric in the summer right before the election was to create a culture of fear that led right up into the election. And as soon as the election was over, the story went away, even though Park 51, or the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, still exists today. 2012 election, we saw a very similar thing happen. In the run up to the 2012 election came the anti-Sharia legislation, right, which was attempted to be passed in over 24 states. It was never about getting anti-Sharia legislation passed, but it was about actually promoting an Islamophobic narrative in the run up to an election. So we have to ask ourselves as Americans a deeper, more fundamental question. Why is it that anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia has become an accepted form of bigotry that allows for this to happen from elected officials in the run-up to an election. Now, what we have seen since the election is that not only has that narrative subsided, it's actually intensified. And it's not, again, not just against Muslims. The Southern Poverty Law Center says that crimes against Jewish Americans has increased, homophobic crimes, crimes against African Americans. Could we even fathom that in elite Ivy League universities, you would see dolls being lynched, symbolizing white supremacy? And so this last Republican primary and election has scratched the surface and allowed for the entry of white supremacy as part of the public discourse. And this is extremely dangerous because it eats away at America's fabric. And so when we talk about what is dangerous, what's at stake here is what America is. And I think that's where the story or the conversation needs to go to.
Yeah. And we also have to remember that this has always been in American society. It's just that it's been given permission to come out from the fringes. And these people have felt empowered to walk down the streets of our major cities, openly espousing this rhetoric proudly. And they've been empowered with social media. They've been, I mean, all the accusations that people throw at Muslims about how Muslims can be radicalized in social media and whatnot, the exact thing is happening with white supremacy, and the exact same thing is happening with bigotry against all these other groups. And we are not taking that as a danger, like we meaning greater society, in a way that they've amplified somehow the Muslim threat to some existential threat. There is an existential threat in this country that's tearing our country apart. And it is the division along these lines where one group of people is being allowed to subjugate and victimize any other minority group. And now the permission has been given from the top. So the only way to push back against it is we as a society need to look at our resources and be able to push back again. And one thing I want to say that is a really good news story, because I'm getting depressed with all this, everything that we've been talking about, is that in the last year, the fight against Islamophobia has been mainstreamed for the first time ever. So we've gone from the fight against Islamophobia being us and a few allies kind of on the fringes to it being embraced by, frankly, a majority of Americans, and being embraced in such a way that everyone from corporate America to groups of people that have never met a Muslim are willing to pour in the streets in the tens of thousands to defend the most vulnerable Muslims who are being impacted by the refugee ban. And companies are saying, you know what, I'm going to put a Muslim in my ad because I want people to see that I've taken a stand. That people who have never taken a stand on this issue have decided to do that, and we now have an opportunity to formalize that. We have an opportunity to amplify it. We have an opportunity to feed it, and to then use that for all of the other groups as well that are being marginalized and victimized. I think an especially important note that Dr. Fahmy referred to was the rise of anti-Semitism. I have not seen as much anti-Semitism in my lifetime as I've seen in the last year. And Jewish American groups are and should be horrified by it. And instead of this dichotomy where we're being pitted against each other, we now have an opportunity to put our resources together and work together. And in the process of not just eliminating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism from society, but then educating even our own communities in terms of the way we deal with each other. So I'm seeing all these opportunities arise that I think we really need to pounce on and take advantage of.
So if we have our listeners, viewers online, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat section, and we'll have a Q&A session a little later. So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to pose to both of you. If the threat is coming from white supremacy, right? Why is it that people don't think that, right? Because perception is reality. Why is it that the media isn't doing a good enough job of educating the public as to where the real threats are coming from? That's question number one. Second question is, what can we learn from history? Because Muslims are not the first group in American history to be marginalized. The same thing happened to the Jews, happened to the Irish, happened to the Catholic, happened to the Chinese, to the Japanese Americans, and you name it. What can we learn from history when other minorities have been singled out in such a way? What did they do that was effective in helping their community bounce back?
Do you want me to take that first?
There's a bit of a lag, so I apologize, Dr. Fahmy, if you want to go first.
Sorry, what? The second part of the question, you know, it's often said, well, Muslim Americans are not the first community, right? It's just, you know, it's your turn, right? But if we look at what anti-Semitism or fascism did to 6 million Jews and Gypsies in Germany, or what happened to the Irish, or the internment of the Japanese, this is not acceptable. This is not anyone's turn. This led to not just the elimination of millions of people, or the decimation of identity. This continues until today. When we talk about the language of McCarthyism, or what happened during Japanese internment, or the othering of Vietnamese, these actually led to wars. And so when we think about the long-term effects of othering, it's actually very violent. And when we look at what's happening at this moment, I know that people are couching the rise of Islamophobia as the new McCarthyism of today. I actually think it's worse, and I worry about the foreign policy implications that will come on the backs of marginalized communities in this country. But going back to what Shahed was mentioning in terms of the positive story, what we saw in the past couple of weeks of everyday Americans saying not in our name, of going to airports, thousands of people showing up at airports, hundreds of thousands of people coming together all over the country, saying not just not in our name, but we will stand in front of Muslims, we will stand in front of immigrants, we will stand in front of refugees, we will stand in front of women, and with women, we will stand against homophobia, because all of what is happening is so antithetical to American values. And this leads to your first question of what is really happening. You know, as someone who studies the Middle East primarily, I'm very in tune with what authoritarian narrative sounds like, or the pathology of authoritarianism. And so if you recall when President Trump was being nominated during the Republican convention, he comes on in the final night to accept the nomination. And while he's speaking, the audience start to chant, and this is something I won't forget, yes, you can do it. Only you can do it. This was very different from the chant of the past of yes, we can, we as Americans, we as citizens, we as a collective. We start to create a pathology of authoritarianism where only one person is the silver bullet that will fix everything. You open the door to, well, the media is a bunch of liars, right? Where facts don't matter, where the history of the conditions that protect the essence of democracy can be mocked. This starts to erode all of those checks on the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom of conversation. So it's not just what has the media done for me lately, it's what has the country allowed to happen in the rise of a pseudo-authoritarian figure that has really undercut things like the CIA, undercut things like the media, undercut institutions like Congress. And so when we think about what all this means to the fabric of democracy, we need to think about how do we go back and reclaim what America is institutionally in terms of its narrative so that we can have a future that's forward-looking. And so while this is a very critical moment in our history, and it's unprecedented in many ways, it's also unprecedented to see everyday Americans showing up at the airports and saying, Muslims, we welcome you, and cheering as Muslims pray in the airport. We have, you know, there's a stat out there that anti-Muslim sentiment was higher during the election than it was 1 week after 9/11 because of the nature of the rhetoric during the campaign. But positive Muslim sentiment today in the eyes of everyday Americans is higher than it has been in a very long time. And that's because everyday Americans will not accept the narrative of divisiveness and pseudo-fascism.
Absolutely, and I want to stress to people to recognize what has happened that's been really, really positive. There are two Americas right now. There's an America that has decided concretely to embrace us as fellow Americans, and they're willing to actually put their bodies on the line to protect that. And then we have people who are now in power and government who are willing to listen to a fringe who believe that we don't belong here. And I will put my faith in my neighbors any day over any government. And I would also say that I believe in the power of ordinary Americans over any government. And so this is what I mean when I feel like there's actually something really, really, really positive to work with here. But we have a window, right? We have a window of opportunity. There are people of goodwill who are coming out and defending us and are willing to see us protected like they would see any other group protected. The question I have for everybody here is, what are we going to do to reinforce our place by their side? And whenever I'm asked by the media about how do you feel as a Muslim after the election of Trump, I always say the same thing. I said, you know something? I'm more worried about the 11 million undocumented worry, right? There are many people in line in front of me that I'm going to now put myself in front of so that I can defend them. And I believe that when the time comes for someone to defend me, I believe that if someone tries to take me away, that 10 of my neighbors will stand in front of me and say, no way. But we have to do our part too. We can't be self-serving with this. You know, people aren't doing this just out of goodwill. They're doing it with an expectation that we are going to repay that with our resources and our kindness and our strength and our funds. And so now's the time that we can't be panicked. We can't withdraw into our shells. We can't be in despair. We need to rise to this challenge. We have the majority of Americans behind our back. This is our time to shine. If there's any time to show the value of our community to the rest of America, now is that time. And there's going to be many ways to do that in the creative realms, in the entrepreneurial realms, in the political realms, in the activist realms. Everybody has a role, but we need to rise to that challenge now while people are looking at us.
So Shahed, let's actually build on that. If I'm a typical Muslim out there, right? I've got 9 to 5. I'm not an activist for a living. I'm not a university professor. What can I do locally with my limited resources, with my limited time, with my limited exposure to this world, right? The world of activism. What can I do, as you say, to reciprocate the goodwill that has been coming from other communities? Some action items, if we can.
Okay, Dalia.
So I think everyone can do something. If you live on a block without a recycling program, start a recycling program. If you have kids that are young, you know, start a play date with your neighbors. You know, hearts are not moved by anything more than human interaction. And statistically speaking, positive impressions of Muslims goes up as soon as you meet a Muslim, right? And you realize that we all care about, you know, our cholesterol and our kids doing well in school, or if you live here in New Jersey, what are our taxes going to look like? And really thinking about, what does it mean to build community? What does it mean to really know your neighbor? You know, during the 2008 economic crisis, how many people that living on my street were having real difficulty? This is a time where you come together and say, you know, we're going to bind together as a nation. The same way President Roosevelt did it during the Great Depression. The same way when there's a crisis, that we all come together in the name of being Americans for a greater purpose. Everyone can do their part. And their part is nothing more than being civic-minded and being civically engaged and knowing who your local representative is and knocking on their door. If you're a physician, participate in a free clinic. You know, there are many free clinics all over this country that are run by Muslims, not for cachet, other than it's part of their social service agenda. There are many play groups or, you know, babysitting groups run by mothers who want to just take care of their neighbors in their neighborhoods. This is how we remember that we are part of the same fabric. And so not everyone has to be an activist, not everyone has to run for public office or do all the wonderful entrepreneurial work that Shahed is doing, but it's really about, what does it mean to be a neighbor in America today? to, put our cell phones down and knock on your neighbor's door and say, I'm here with you. And we're going to make some changes. And if it starts with recycling, so be it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you've hit on it. And a sobering fact is that the anti-Muslim movement in this country was built on grassroots efforts. It's typical people forwarding these chain emails to each other and ginning up fear at a very grassroots level. And so our answer to that has to also be at that grassroots level. So I went to a high school that was right-leaning, and I was one of the very few people who were Muslim there. And I just went to my 30-year high school reunion. And even the people who were there that were Trump supporters came up and purposely said, you belong in my America. You are an example of, when I think of Muslims, I think of you, and that makes me want to include you in my America. I've had friends who were at Tea Party meetings who said, when people started veering into anti-Muslim sentiment, would stand up and say, I have a friend who works in the Obama administration and he's a Muslim and I would take a bullet for him. And I don't ask these people to do these things, but when you contribute to their life in a meaningful way, at a personal way, you've inoculated them forever. I mean, I hope every American grows up with a close Muslim friend, because then Islamophobia would disappear overnight in this country. But that takes us being able to put, us in that kind of vulnerable position, right? Whether you're a child at a public school or whether you're in the public space dealing with your neighbors, right? Now's the time to come out of our shells. We're being invited to come out of our shells by our neighbors, and we're being put on stages and we're being put on podiums. Now's the time to embrace that and not be afraid. I'm not afraid. I want to just make that very clear to people. I am not afraid. We have the Constitution on our side. We have the American people on our side. We've got God on our side. We've got morals and values on our side. There's nothing to be afraid of, but we have to act on it.
I remember I read a Pew poll. This was several years ago, and it was asking about people's impression of Islam and Muslims. And those who had a negative impression of Islam and Muslims, somewhere around over 80% of those negatively had never met a Muslim. And those that had a positive impression of Islam and Muslims, over 80% of them knew a Muslim personally. So I echo the sense that I'm getting from both of you, is that personal relationships matter. And in my experience, personal relationships have a far bigger impact on people's perception of Islam and Muslims than the president, than any news channel or radio channel or what have you. It's all about the personal relationships. I know one thing that has helped us tremendously here at ISNA has been the interfaith work that we have done. That is now bearing fruit, the relationships that we have been working on for several decades. And that's something that actually everyone can do at the local level. If you're a Muslim, go to your nearest church, talk to the pastor or to the priest and say, hi. That kind of thing goes a really long way. Send them a letter, send them a postcard, attend one of their services, get up on Sunday morning, right, and attend their service, or go to the synagogue, go to your local Hindu temple, whatever the case may be, go to a Rotary Club meeting, go to, any type of event as a Muslim, interact, have a smile on your face, get to know people, and you would be amazed. You'd be absolutely amazed at the type of impact that has. I know, because I've done that kind of thing before. And I've had people come up to me and tell me and say, look, you're the first Muslim that I've ever met. I mean, people that are in their 50s, right? They've never met a Muslim. And so when you've never met a Muslim, it's very easy to be brainwashed by everything that they're seeing on TV. Right? At the end of the day, they're only human. They have vulnerabilities like everybody else. And if they're just getting bad news about Muslims from one side, we have to counter that with good news from that.
I want to remind people of an example from last year, and that was Muhammad Ali.
Dr. Fahmy, what else? What other?
Go ahead, Shahed.
Okay.
Go ahead, Shahed.
Yes,
Go
I
ahead.
want to remind people of this example because in the middle of a heated campaign where people were ginning up anti-Muslim sentiment, the entire country paused, including conservative Americans, including the Republican establishment, including all the candidates. They paused to honor arguably the most famous American in the world who happens to be Muslim and the most loved Muslim in America, to honor him and honor him for what he had done. Now, reminding you that he was hated in this country. He was hated for his religion. He was hated for his political stance. He was hated for being black and being an activist. He overcame that in American culture to the point where every American honored him when he died. In that is a lesson for all of us, right? How did he transform hearts so that he went from hated to loved by even the same people today that are ginning up anti-Muslim sentiment? And what can we learn from his experience and the way he handled it himself with dignity, with grace, with charity, with contributions, all the things that he did in his life that won people over? And how can we do that as a community? Like, we have a model right in front of us.
You know, Muhammad Ali's charitable contributions alone, just charitable contributions alone, affected the lives of 260,000 people. And I think brings me to the kind of last point I wanted to make. It's very easy to vilify those who clutch on to white supremacy, and I don't want us to fall victim to doing that. According to Princeton University, the #1 suicide rate is among uneducated white males in the Midwest who feel that their country is coming out of their grasp. The #1 suicide rate is among uneducated white males. And so we have to ask ourselves collectively, what do we owe them? What can we do for them? How can we start the healing process of this nation? And so I don't want us to fall into the vilification of the other as well. Rather, understanding the grievances of the other. What causes people to hold on to fascist narratives, exclusionary narratives, the othering? There has to be a core reason. And if it's that America is being redefined, well, then it takes the perception that America is being redefined to actually reach out to those who feel that this is a negative thing. And I think this is going to be a national project. It has to be. And so, you know, I know we're going to end in a few minutes, but I don't want us to end saying we started with white supremacy and that needs to be, of course, eradicated. But let us not vilify those that believe in it, because there's something else going on here. We have to think of what has our history taught us about those that vilify, is that there is some kind of economic and social conditions that lead to that to rise and to gain traction in this country and in other places as well. And so the reaching out is going to not just be across the aisle and across neighborhoods, but it's going to have to be throughout America. Those big grassroots efforts are going to have to be localized in a really deep way in places like the Rust Belt that have been ignored historically by this very country, in places like the inner cities of here in New Jersey, like Camden, New Jersey, where unemployment is 44%. How does that continue to happen in the wealthiest nation? I live in the wealthiest state in the country, and we have some of the poorest cities. How can that happen? And so when we talk about justice, the fight for justice for Muslims can't end with Muslims. The fight for justice has to be for all of us. And so when we broaden that scope to reorient ourselves to, well, this might be a symptom of a larger problem. And it's easy to vilify Muslims because bigotry has been acceptable. But there are many communities that are hurting. And so reaching out to those who believe in the most atrocious voices of othering, right? We have to ask ourselves, if this is at an all-time high, what are the conditions that have led this increase? And really do that communal grassroots outreach that Shahed had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I want to add to that because I completely agree with everything you just said. One of the mottos we have at Affinis Labs is "By Muslims for Everybody," and we also have latched onto entrepreneurship as the primary means through which we contribute to the world. And the reason is because entrepreneurship is a very powerful empowerment vehicle. It makes people feel self-worth. It makes them feel like they're in control of their destiny. And it's also an answer to the way the world has changed so drastically that huge swaths of this world are left with no means to support themselves. This economic upheaval, I mean, I feel honestly sorry for those people who voted for Trump thinking that he's going to bring back jobs that are not going to exist anymore. As companies tear away their workforces, they replace them with robots, or they replace them with outsourcing, or they replace them by being more efficient. There will never be enough jobs for people, and this problem will continue unless we do something to get people on their feet and take their economic futures into their own hands. So we're actively looking for ways to use our resources, not just to help Muslim communities around the world, but to help marginalized communities writ large around the world, whether they're here in America or in other places. And then using that as a way to soften people's hearts in terms of the Muslim contribution to the world. I mean, it's a small step, but I mean, this is, you know, and again, everyone has their role to play, but this is the role we've chosen to play, is how can we leverage entrepreneurship in this fashion?
So we have an online question, and I think this is a great question. It's, how can people in rural areas be allies for Muslims or other minority groups? I think that's a great question. Oftentimes, when we think of these issues, we think of them in an urban context, right? Most of us live in, you know, medium to large cities, but a big portion of America lives in rural America, and the dynamics there are different than in a city. So do either of you have any advice for somebody who'd like to be more active and who just happens to live out in the country?
Absolutely. I run one of the most comprehensive mosque databases in America. And if you look through that website, you'll see that there's not a place in this country, I don't care how rural you get, that you won't find a Muslim community. And what I've also found is that Muslims who live in rural America are often more integrated than Muslims who live in urban America. And so my answer to that is, it's pretty easy to find your Muslim neighbors. They're there. Go reach out to them. Find out how they can enhance your life and vice versa. And frankly, I think the model for integration and coexistence is going to come from those parts of America, where you have people of maybe diverging political opinions, but they live together in harmony. I've heard this from all my Muslim friends who've grown up in rural America, that their experience growing up, they felt really bonded with their neighbors despite the religious differences. So I think there's something there that rural America can teach us.
I think it's an interesting statistic, but something, I think almost 60% of doctors' visits in rural America are by doctors who are immigrants. Because most medical placements of immigrant doctors happen in the middle of the heartland or in rural areas. So the idea that there are no Muslims, as you said, in the heartland, or that there are no Muslims actually performing some of the most important services is not true. They're there, and not just are they well integrated, they're mainly your doctors, they're your engineers. And one of the saddest thing about this immigration ban and Muslim ban and is that when the immigration laws were changed in the 1960s, opening immigration to the Levant and South Asia and the Middle East, the people that came are the people that were the doctors and engineers and scientists that helped build this country, right? The NASA experts, the chemists, the physicists, the physicians. There's a reason why when you go into a lot of even government agencies, scientific agencies, most of the people are brown. Right? It was the great brain drain. They left their home countries and established an intellectual hub and community in the science and technology in the United States, which led to the great growth of the 70s and 80s. And so the idea that these are the very people you want to ban, who left their home countries to build this one, is so, I don't know what the right word is, because saying hurtful is not enough. It's so antithetical to what America was and becoming and continues to be, that you ban the very people who left their countries as the intellectual class, came here and built not just the scientific class, but the middle class of the United States in many parts of the country, and say to them, thanks, but no thanks. Not only do we not want you, we actually never did. And what they didn't do for their own countries, they did for this one because this became their home.
Well put. I can't add to it.
I think what is easy for us to overlook, especially if you're not necessarily a recent immigrant to the United States, is that America is a young country. And we don't have the rich history that, for example, the Chinese have, or the Egyptians going back thousands of years, or Europe going back thousands of years. America is a young country, and we're not built necessarily on a particular culture, history. Instead, we are built on principles. We are built on ideals. The amazing things about America is that you can be new to this country. Maybe you've been in America for a year or two, but as long as you accept the ideals and principles for which America stands, you are fully American, as much as somebody, a third, fourth, fifth generation American. And that is something, in my opinion, that is unique about this country. And that's one of those things that makes it very, very, very attractive, is that anyone can be an American. You have to adopt the principles, and you're 100% there. And we're losing that to some extent by taking this very exclusionary posturing towards immigrants and looking down at immigrants and being threatened of immigrants, forgetting what attracted them to America in the first place. Don't lose in the coming years, and we are just about out of time, so I will give the closing remarks to each of you. Dr. Fahmy, if we can start with you, 1 to 2 minutes each, please.
When we think about the ideals this country was founded on, it was all about pluralism and inclusivity. And it wasn't about being ever a melting pot. It was about celebrating our diversity. And I teach nationhood and national identity at the university. When we think of what is a nation, it's usually defined as the myth of a shared ancestry. Every country has a myth of a shared ancestry. In the United States, we don't have a myth of a shared ancestry because everyone is from somewhere. And so what we do have is a myth of a future belonging. And so when we think about the beauty of the foundation of this country, of our Constitution, of this place the founders wanted that was religiously neutral, that was going to celebrate the pluralism that was coming to it, this is a story that exists nowhere. And so America is, and why it's exceptional to many peoples all over the world, we really have to consider, what is this moment telling us about our history? Are we losing what makes America exceptional by not only not celebrating our pluralism, but by embracing exclusionary narratives that are based on myths of belonging that are not really there, when the foundational myth of this nation is belonging to a future? And so what's at stake, I think, is the deeper historical narrative, the historical memory of what this country is, what it means to be, and what it can be. And that's what we have to hold on to.
Definitely, I completely agree with that. We are in a very pivotal place when it comes to the development of the American Muslim community as a whole, or communities as a whole. We still have relatively a plate upon which to build. We still have to coalesce what our values are for our grandkids, what's our culture, what are our modes of interacting with our neighbors, and we've been pulled into the spotlight, maybe prematurely, but God has His ways, right? The decisions we make now about the direction we go in as a community are going to affect not just the way Islam is practiced as an identity and as a religion by our grandchildren, but frankly, whether or not they will be Muslim. I strongly believe that. And so I can't stress this enough. We have to make those brave, difficult, but correct choices now. We have to not be afraid. We have to approach America from a position of dignity and strength, not victimization. If you look at yourself as being victimized, by definition, you're in survival mode. You're not in a position to help other people. And if you're not helping other people, you're not proving your value to your fellow Americans. And frankly, we do have a lot of resources. I know there's discrepancies within the American Muslim communities, but there are enough of us with means and enough of us with access that we can do the right thing and chart a course so that my grandkids will be proud to be Muslim, will have a roadmap in front of them as to how to interact with people, and that our neighbors won't think twice before saying, of course my Muslim neighbors are fully American, and of course I feel safer with them as neighbors than without, right? How do we bring about that America? Those decisions all start now, and every single person has a role to play in that.
I want to thank you both for taking time out of your day to join this webinar. Your insights have been very valuable. I'm sure everyone who tuned in has benefited tremendously. All of those online that have joined us, thank you for taking time out of your day. We hope that you've benefited from this webinar. And I'd like for you to join us for our next webinar on March 7th. When we will be discussing a saying of the Prophet in which he said that there will come a time when holding on to your faith will be like holding on to hot coal. And that will be March 7th, so stay connected at ISNA.net, and I hope to see you then. God bless.